Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's Tim Richter here, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Want to welcome you to our webinar to release a new draft toolkit ending homelessness for people living in encampments. I'm joined by my friend Iain Jong, who will lead us through a presentation shortly. Just a couple things. Our agenda, like most of our webinars, is fairly straightforward. We'll do a quick introduction. We'll have a presentation from Iain outlining the toolkit itself, and open it up for questions and answers, and then we'll have a quick closing. So housekeeping items first, just to know everybody is muted. If you have any questions, if you want to ask a question during the presentation, please put it in the Q&A tab just so we keep track. You're also welcome to use the chat function to chat amongst your peers on the call, share any comments, speak to your other participants, but I do ask you to put questions into the Q&A just so that I can keep track of them. Also, we'll have the webinar recorded and will be posted on our website. I'll just double check that link, but we'll get that. It'll be posted on our website. Or the toolkit itself is posted on our website, and the webinar will be posted along with it. So just a bit about this project. So in September of this year, seems like a year of Mondays since then, but in September, we, along with everybody else, were beginning to observe a rise in the number of people sleeping rougher in encampments as a result of COVID. And we wanted to give communities tools for a housing-focused and rights-based approach to ending homelessness for people living in encampments. One of our concerns was that municipalities and others may lean into an enforcement approach that is ineffective and largely inappropriate, and wanted to make sure that we had some appropriate housing-focused tools for communities, and that's where this toolkit comes from. The report that we're releasing today has been reviewed by people lived experience, frontline organizations, community-based organizations, service managers, and housing rights experts. It's important that we emphasize that housing with person-centered supports is the solution to homelessness for people living in encampments. We are not proposing an enforcement-based approach to encampments. And finally, just to let you know, this is designed to be a living document, is being released as a draft for discussion because we know that there are a lot of opinions and a lot of different perspectives on responding to encampments and supporting people in encampments and ending homelessness for people in encampments. So what we want to do is put this out there, offer some guidance, but also create an opportunity for a discussion where we can update the document as required. So the next steps, there's a link here, and this presentation and Iain's slides will also be posted to the website. So go on our website, look for a blog post on this topic. People are invited to send written feedback to our email at info@caeh.ca. And we're going to be taking written feedback until about September 26th.
February.
February. I'm giving us a little extra time, right? February 26th, 2021. And we'll also be hosting some roundtables with experts and others so that we have an opportunity to toolkit users and people lived experience. So we'll get an opportunity to get some feedback there as well. And a final version of the report will be published in March. Okay, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Iain. Iain has led the development of this toolkit and has done a great job of integrating feedback from an awful lot of people. I will now stop share and turn it over to Iain to get started. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Tim, and a very good day to all of you as I pull up my presentation. Just give me one moment, please. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be part of an initiative that I feel very passionate about and know that other people feel very passionate about as well. And that is a focus on ending homelessness and looking at ending homelessness specifically through the lens of how best do we support, engage, listen to, participate in planning with, and support people that are living in encampments. And this opportunity to engage in the preparation of this draft report for discussion has been more of a labor of love than anything else, to hear and respond and process different perspectives on the issue of encampments. And I think that we are in a position where we can continue to learn more, collectively listen to each other and the various points of view, and arrive at a place by March where we have a published document on encampments in Canada that has focused on ending homelessness. I want to say welcome to everybody who is here today. And I want to say a particular welcome to people with lived experience who might be on the call today, who have firsthand experience of living in encampments. I want to say welcome to service providers, especially those that have engaged with people living in encampments, whether that is through street outreach at a day center or even shelter providers who occasionally support or provide immediate assistance to people living in encampments. And also a big welcome to service managers, community-based organizations, and a big welcome to other experts and advocates who might be joining us on this webinar today, who have been so helpful at providing just a rich tapestry of ideas around how to move forward in our discussion as a nation of what needs to be the most appropriate response for people living in encampments. The purpose of engaging in this exercise is to stimulate discussion. And that discussion likely needs to happen at several levels, and those several levels may need to happen concurrently as opposed to consecutively. If we think about the local level, that is where most response, most concern, most resources available to assist people living in encampments are situated. It's also the location at the municipal level where you'll hear the most concern, but also complaints about people that are in encampments. So there needs to be conversation at a local level. How are we organizing our resources? How are we providing housing-focused solutions? How are we engaging with municipal elected officials? How does this fit with the community plan to end homelessness? How does the response line up to funding that's available at the local level, even if it might come from the province or federal territory or federal government? But if there's municipal dollars, we need to account for those. And then we need to also think through what is the investment strategy at that local level relative to encampments. There are definitely provincial and territorial matters that need to be considered when it comes to encampments. So that can include everything from engagement with income assistance and benefits for people to engagement in health-based resources, and the federal discussion. The investments, for example, of reaching home dollars can be part of the local investment that goes into serving the needs of people living in encampments. And so with that discussion of multiple orders of government, the intention is to look at housing solutions for people living in encampments, as well as safe, appropriate interim measures like shelter to better meet the needs of people living in encampments. And I want to stress, when we talk about interim measures, no one is suggesting that shelters are the answer or the only answer to encampments. They have to be seen as an interim measure, and we need to stress that those shelter environments must be safe and appropriate to actually maximize the usefulness of them in a response to encampments. We also wanted to try and help frame what a rights-based and housing-focused approach might look like. And in particular, to really drill down an understanding, for example, what are some housing options that might be quicker than traditional site-built construction, that might increase the availability of housing for people who experience homelessness, including those people who live in encampments. And then the purpose is to provide some interim guidance. So thinking about service managers, community-based organizations, people in those leadership positions within community around how can you expand housing and shelter options? How can we provide services to people living in encampments, including COVID-related and weather-related considerations? What data do we collect? How do we collect it? How do we use it? And to be really clear that the function of data collection is to help inform services and know about outcomes. It's not an exercise in surveillance, and it's not intended to be collected for enforcement purposes. And how do we lead in this space? So in particular, because of the local interface, most often what we see is leadership within government or an appointed body by the government to do the following: to organize services, to track progress, to convene appropriate entities, and in extreme cases, to oversee the closure of an encampment. And I'll also stress at this point that we're really talking about those as extreme cases. Only after housing options have been exhausted would be the preference, and when there's legal justification or imminent safety issues that might cause for an encampment to be closed. So an example that might come to mind, or that comes to mind for me, is an encampment that's in a floodplain, where we know it's a time of year where there are flood risks, where there might be the necessity to relocate or close an encampment. This work isn't going to be relevant unless we look at the current realities. And so a couple of slides just to lay out the kind of 30,000-foot view of the terrain as seen that informed the development of this draft. So the first reality is that while we don't have data, what is happening in the conversations that I've been having with communities throughout the country, and certainly with the conversations I know that the Canadian Alliance has been having with communities throughout the country, is that encampments seem to be on the rise. And they seem to be on the rise in rural, suburban, and urban environments. And for those communities that have had encampments historically, many are reporting that there are more encampments or larger encampments. And there are also some communities that have never historically had encampments, or very rarely had encampments, where they have been more commonplace, especially during COVID. In those new communities, there is some thoughts around how do we respond, or there's some questions around how do we respond, what's the most effective approach is, it's new to them. In communities that have had existing encampments, I would also say, just as a broader sentiment, that communities are looking for additional guidance and input, and in particular, how to navigate the competing interests and opinions related to encampments. The response to the encampments, as I was suggesting in my introduction, most often falls to the local order of government or its designate, like a community-based organization. That reality is that, essentially all politics are local on some level, and encampments become hyper-local just because they're place-based, and they have a response to the fact that they're place-based. And it's usually local orders of government through the municipal council that councillors that concerns, whether that be about people's welfare or about use of public space or about trash or about people's health. I mean, both positive and negative orientation usually fall on those ears. Despite considerable progress that's been made in many parts of the country to be really housing focused as a system of care, encampments remain. And I think this reality is important for us to lean into as well, because those same communities that tell a story of the volume of people that they've been able to serve through coordinated access and get into housing or support in housing, or to get into supportive housing, or to reunite with family and friends, or even overall reductions. When other people, especially those in the general public, see encampments, and especially see larger encampments, or see encampments in communities that never had encampments, that narrative, while data driven, is difficult for people to understand. How is it that you can say that we're experiencing reductions in homelessness? How could it possibly be true that you house that many people and I still see people living outside? There are some that advocate for a service-rich response to encampments, and others, and it's the local reality in many parts of the country, where it has been, at least historically, an enforcement-first response. And that enforcement-first response may be through formalized mechanisms of posting notice and cleaning encampments, but there's also many reported instances of an enforcement-first response that doesn't follow any process other than bylaw or law enforcement telling people that they must move along, and some isolated stories of individuals in encampments who talk about things like their tents being slashed by people in authority, making them unable to occupy that space. There are legitimate reasons, based upon a number of factors, for some encampments to be relocated or closed. While the preference is always going to be for a housing-focused solution, and while the preference will always be for a rights-based approach, and while the preference will always be to take more time, if we think about situations like the floodplain example that I mentioned, there could be compelling reasons to relocate or close and camp in those realities. And we have to think through, how do we do that in a way that is going to decrease the negative impacts and increase the positive impacts, like access to housing or other forms of support that the individual couple or family might need. Going on, any response to encampments has to consider the National Housing Strategy Act, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That more work is needed, I'll say required, to operationalize both this rights-based approach and housing-focused approach, what it means in practice. And I think that we have some good promising starts or spotlights that we can put on some practices in that regard, but certainly more work to bring that to scale and increase understanding of that. To appreciate that there are very polarized views in opinions on engagement, support, what homeless resolution means, whether or not encampments should be sanctioned, whether or not encampments should have street outreach workers that engage with them, the level of organization and governance the people living within encampments themselves have, how to engage with people living in encampments. There's still considerable debate in that area. And I think we also need to appreciate, as has been made more acute as we work through this process, that just as homelessness is diverse, so too are encampments. And people living within encampments are also not homogeneous. So we do need to think about, understand, and better support and respond to, for example, the needs of Indigenous people, women, youth, and people of color who are living in encampments, based upon both their unique circumstances and experiences, as well as the strengths that they have. There is currently no national definition of what constitutes an encampment. And even in the experience we've had working throughout North America, we find that there's few communities that have actually got to the place of defining an encampment. And why this is important is you have some individuals who sleep rough, who might be in a different location from night to night to night. And you'll have other people that are more organized and might be more centrally located in one place. So both are examples of unsheltered homelessness. Are both examples of encampments? Or does encampment imply that there is a structure not designed for permanent human habitation, like someone sleeping in their car or RV or a tent or another humanly designed and constructed shelter? So that needs to be considered. Things like the location, the type of structures. There's a time dimension. So if the few examples that exist out there relative to encampments can be all over the map, defining encampments can be all over the map in terms of how long a place has to be occupied to be considered encampment. Is it 3 or more consecutive nights in the same location with the same people? Is it 7 or more nights in the same location with the same people? And that might seem somewhat trivial, but if you think about resource allocation and ensuring that we have capacity of social service responders to be engaged with people living in encampments, demand might exceed supply if we're not careful and thoughtful around which encampments to put some of those resources in, as well as to understand that the larger an encampment gets, usually the more complexity that comes with it. Not that complexity is a bad thing, it's not necessarily negative, but more people is more stuff, it is more interaction, it is likely more visible. The realities of specific populations, mentioned briefly on the previous slide, and we may also need to consider whether or not it occurs on public land or private land. There are some jurisdictions that have completely different approaches based upon whether or not it's on public land or private land. So part of the work that we want to be able to continue to do leading up to March is to see if we can come up with an agreed upon definition of an encampment that would transcend different parts of the country, or at least provide a framework within which localities can develop their own definition of an encampment, but are considering all relevant components of that definition. There are definitely right to housing and charter considerations as we think through the most appropriate way of supporting and responding to people's housing needs in an encampment. It is understood and accepted that efforts to work with people in encampment should embrace a human rights-based approach. It's also stating that we need to reflect the legal obligations of all governments to uphold the National Housing Strategy, as well as the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the key point here that has come up in certain discussions related to encampments is this idea that people who are experiencing homelessness who live in encampments do not surrender their rights. And we need to see them as rights holders. We need to see them as the charter applying to them the same way that it applies to anybody who is housed. We also know from some case law from the likes of British Columbia that local anti-camping bylaws may violate elements of the charter. And that is definitely a consideration moving forward, because I am doubtful that there are locations throughout the country that want to knowingly violate the charter. And that said, there are additional sections of the charter that might also be relevant specifically to the rights of people living in encampments. So we don't want to develop a local strategy, a provincial territorial strategy, a national strategy that in any way frames it as a violation of those rights. The national protocol, which is a really helpful document for thinking through some elements of responding to encampments, which came out earlier this year, it has 8 core principles to it. And this is a summary distilled into 5 that may help in an initial framing of how we think about encampments. So to ensure that people's right to housing is strengthened, responses to encampments must maintain appropriate housing as a solution to homelessness. Homelessness response systems continue to ensure that people in encampments have access to housing, as well as interim measures like safe and appropriate shelter if it is desired. That engagement with persons in encampments be grounded in a commitment to destruct ineffective and inequitable colonial-based approaches and to acknowledge the distinct experiences of Indigenous people. The human rights of people in encampments are not violated, and people living in the encampment are provided opportunities for meaningful participation in matters that pertain to them. Nothing about us without us. The draft then says that to be effective in the space of engaging with people living in encampments and to provide a solution to that, then housing is going to be the preferred option. And as I mentioned, interim measures like shelter may also be considered. But suffice to say, waiting until there's enough housing constructed from coast to coast to coast to meet all needs of all people experiencing homelessness is probably not going to be viable. The system likely can't support that. The demands that the resource demands that go into supporting people in encampments can be quite high. And so if we can get to a place where individuals living in encampments have housing options with support options within existing housing stock, or leveraging all existing options first, that may be a preferred approach to take action on housing items until such time as we have an adequate amount of safe, appropriate, affordable housing that is newly constructed. So we need to be creative and we need to be urgent. And this is a part of the report that I think could be strengthened with more input from more jurisdictions throughout the country to learn more about some of the housing options that have been expanded or tried in your community that have been effective that may be replicated, whether that's a community of the same scale and similar characteristics as yours, or an idea that might be brought to scale on a different level if it was known by other people. Now, when it comes to shelter, shelters don't end encampments. They can be part of the response to encampments, but we have to remember that people do not have to be forced to go live in shelter. In other words, people have freedom. They can deny shelter space or shelter options that are presented for them. And I bring this up because there's a reality in some communities in the country where there are large encampments and adequate space in shelter at the same time. That might be signs of ineffective sheltering practices, might be opportunities to dig deeper into how we can make improvements in shelter. But it also is a proof point that just because you have shelter capacity doesn't mean that all encampments go away. So the range of expanded housing options that are brought forward in the report are as follows. And this, as I said, is a preliminary list that we look to expand on with your comments and input. So one idea that's emerged is to provide local portable rent supplements. So this would be local government that thinks about how much they're investing in serving people in encampments and thinking about whether or not some of that investment might work to resolve homelessness within encampments through a housing-focused approach if people who are experiencing homelessness were provided an opportunity to have local portable rent supplements. And the importance of it being portable is it's attached to the person, not attached to a unit. So there's more choice that the individual will have in selecting and moving forward with housing options moving forward. Another innovative approach that for consideration is this idea of crowdsourcing funding. And this is really born from some communities that have had larger encampments where they know that there are members of the public, student groups, faith-based organizations, businesses, etc., that really want to support and help people who are living in encampments. And it may not be appropriate for them to do direct service or volunteer directly on the site, but they feel that they want to do something or they want to mobilize others to come up with solutions. And so crowdsourcing funding can be an approach to gain funding that usually doesn't come with other parameters around it. It's a much more flexible option. So, you know, you could use the funding for first and last month's rent, utility hookups, past arrears. Let's say they have a relative halfway across the country where it would be safe and appropriate for them to go live with the relative, and the relative wants them to live there and they want to go to the relative, having funding to be able to do that. We could also use crowdsource funding to provide direct financial assistance to people living in encampments. So a lot of flexibility in that space. There are some, and I'd say probably a growing number of communities that are expanding housing options through motel acquisition and conversion. This predates COVID, although it's certainly an idea that has gained more traction during the pandemic, as communities or many communities have used motels or hotels as a shelter option for people who are unsheltered in their homelessness. And in this kind of motel acquisition and conversion, there are some communities that essentially operate the motel as is. In other words, it's now a form of housing option. Each one is seen as a distinct unit and move forward from there. And there are other communities that have gone through more of a renovation process, creating community spaces, meeting spaces, upgrading features within the motel prior to people living within the motel as housing. Modular construction, also an approach that is gaining traction, used in a number of communities now because it is seen as being a high quality product that can be manufactured off site, that isn't influenced by the likes of weather, and can be brought and assembled on the site. The acquisition of existing multi-unit buildings, this only makes sense if other low-income people are not displaced through that acquisition. So it might be a project that increases the effectiveness over time, right? So it might start with acquiring a building and then over natural attrition, filling those units with people who've experienced homelessness. A movement towards legalizing rooming houses, and I would even stress in there higher quality rooming houses, or at least rooming houses with minimum occupancy standards and reasonable habitation requirements within them, knowing that there are some communities throughout the country where their rooming houses are completely abysmal and are not places that people desire to live, but other communities where rooming houses might be of higher quality, where people have lived in them for long periods of time. Master leasing is an option. This is proven effective, particularly in communities that have much higher rental costs, where it's difficult to penetrate the market, where usually a nonprofit organization rents the units and then sublets them to individuals experiencing homelessness. The expansion of secondary suites, and again, I'll stress legal secondary suites as another lower cost housing option. And there are communities that are looking at conversion of transitional housing to permanent housing, and in particular, not trying to displace people in that process either. So that can require looking at the intake mechanisms and the length of stay for people in transitional housing, but that is another option as well. Now, I want to stress in these housing options, nobody is saying that any of these are quick. Most of these can't happen overnight. Some of these are even going to be quicker than others of these, but all of these can be faster than traditional construction. And so as we start to think through what might be relevant for your community, or what might be options or tools you could use in your community relative to expanding housing options, of course, you're going to have to look at local context, local opportunities, know something about the politics associated with different approaches and where you might gain political support, especially if it is the local government that's spearheading any of these particular approaches. And expanding shelter options concurrently. So one of the ways that we can do this is to amend existing shelter operations. This in particular gets at an examination or re-examination of things like, how do we prioritize people for shelter in our community? Are there good diversion practices in our shelters? How about access to shelter, or perhaps more accurately, what are the barriers to shelter access in our community? What's the flow through, or sometimes referred to as outflow, from shelters into housing? And are shelters able to get a sufficient amount of turnover because people are moving to safe and appropriate positive exits from the shelter? As well as using all available shelter space. And this has certainly been restricted during COVID with physical distancing. However, I'm certainly aware of at least a few shelters that continue to try to use flexible space, like a dining hall, as physically distanced overnight shelter, even though they may not have people in that space throughout the day. So we might look at existing shelter operations, decreasing barriers and improving opportunities within existing facilities. Optimizing diversion and family and friend unification. This really gets at if people in encampments have safe and appropriate options to live with family and friends, such that it's not going to compromise the family or friends tendency, and it's safe and appropriate, and everybody's in agreement. Whether that family or friend is local or elsewhere, that should be considered. So, you know, family reunification often is local, but doesn't have to be local. Motel rental or acquisition. This, for some communities, will be carrying on what they've already started during COVID or bringing it to a new scale. Sprung structures, mixed feelings about sprung structures personally. And one of the most difficult parts about sprung structures is once they are created, it's difficult to figure out how do we get to a place where they're not needed. But essentially they are really well constructed, heavy duty tents, but come with heating and air circulation, and usually not toilets or showers inside. Those usually have to be brought on site on trailers, but it is a quick way to get structures on the likes of a parking lot or a vacant site for a period of time. Sprung structures might also neatly fit, for example, on part of the property of an existing shelter, and then leveraging the existing infrastructure from that shelter to support the sprung structure. Converting space to overnight shelter, this is usually overnight sheltering exclusively. This is things like engaging in public or private spaces, convention centers, community centers, those sorts of places. The neighborhood-based single-family home shelters is a strategy that where you look at houses for sale that might be of a larger size, that might be amenable to less congregate but still shelter-based approaches. So there's a way to do that more quickly. However, there can be issues with zoning and siting and assessing those particular places. Faith-based organizations, churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, halls, or meeting spaces associated with those. Again, more as an overnight shelter usually. Tapping into service clubs and seeing what they have to offer. Converting transitional housing to shelter-based environments, much like the same strategy for housing options. And then master leasing apartments for use as shelter. Some of you might be familiar for places like New York City. This is one of the major strategies used to shelter homeless families or families experiencing homelessness. All that said, we can't lose sight of the fact that while we're going down the road of trying to expand housing options, and while we're going down the road of potentially expanding shelter options, there's still going to be immediate needs for people living in encampments. And we can't ignore those needs until such time as we have adequate housing. We need to continue to meet those needs in real time while we are concurrently trying to get more housing options and shelter options on board for the community. So what we want to do in that space is make sure public health guidelines are followed. So things like physical distancing between tents is a good example of that. Making sure that there's hand washing opportunities are another example of that. Survival considerations. So things like access to safe prepared food, access to drinking water, seasonally appropriate clothing, protection from the elements, access to a toilet, access to hygiene, access to harm reduction supplies and facilities. And then also direct access to emotional and service supports. And that could look quite differently based upon the unique needs of people living within any particular encampment, but really starting to think through how do we bring professional staff as well as other suitable individuals like trained peers to the encampment rather than expecting people from living in an encampment to go to meet those people elsewhere, unless it's their choice to do so. How do we engage effectively and leverage the work that advocacy organizations may already be doing with people living in encampments? What is the role of volunteers and those sorts of things? Really needs to be considered as part of meeting immediate needs. And examining the existing system of care will also be a prudent consideration to work on minimizing the number of encampments, because people have access to other resources and so don't need to live in encampments. So when we think about this, I start with this idea of equity practices in existing services and really having a careful examination through an equity lens to ensure that all services provide services through an anti-oppression lens that are centered on racial equity and appropriate for the unique needs of each person, couple, or their family receiving services. And it's about eliminating barriers. It's about making sure that people aren't denied service based upon things like race, age, ability, language, cognitive functioning, mental illness, addiction, criminal history, gender, sexuality, housing history, income source, employment status, citizenship status, or marital status. That we also have to look at whether or not we have adequate Indigenous specific services, and in the absence of Indigenous specific services, working to engage with the Indigenous community to make sure that our responses are culturally appropriate, that are centered squarely on matters of decolonization and reconciliation. Trauma-informed care, for obvious reasons. The trauma is widespread within the population of people who experience homelessness generally, and certainly found within people who live in encampments. So we need to respect self-determination and autonomy of participants and build rapport grounded in reciprocity and trust. We've already talked about looking at shelter capacity, shelter entry barriers. So any barriers like sobriety at entry, separating couples, insufficient storage space, not allowing pets, program participation requirements, really carefully and critically examining those and trying to find resolution on those matters. Trying to make sure that we're clearly are rowing in the same direction in terms of service over control when it comes to engagement with services. This is also an opportunity for communities to review service restrictions and banning. So people who live in encampments may be there, and I certainly am not suggesting they are all there for this particular reason, but there are people who live in encampments who are there because there is no shelter that they can go to where they are accepted because they've been denied service at every shelter that exists. And you find that in smaller communities that have limited shelter options quite acutely, but you'll also find it in larger communities where people say, well, I'm banned from everywhere. This is a reason for us to really look at what's driving service restrictions, what's driving these banning practices. Are there different approaches that shelters can be using and be supported to implement that would decrease the volume of people who seem to have, or at least feel, that they have no choice but to be unsheltered? We also need to look at street outreach capacity. And in the response to encampments, we're looking for trained, hopefully more professionalized street outreach capacity to enter into the space. But in the absence of having street outreach workers, there are certainly street outreach functions that need to be put in place relative to encampments. Day services, so are there places for people to go during the day, drop-in centers, those sorts of places? Potentially making some modifications in coordinated access. And the three modifications that might be considered relative to a response to encampments is, do we have adequate mobile access points so that people can get into the system to get out of the system? We might also look at prioritizing unsheltered homelessness in the community as one of the priority variables, certainly not suggesting every unit go to people who are unsheltered, but you might have a proportional allocation of spots or vacancies for people living in encampments. We also need to look at existing investments and services and making sure they're aligned to ending homelessness. Some communities have already done a really great job at re-examining their social housing prioritization and access, in particular for people experiencing homelessness, and having modified chronological access for people who meet certain conditions relative to their homelessness. Access to harm reduction, including supplies, education, outreach, and prevention supports, and access to health, mental health, and other forms of addiction supports will be necessary if we want to be effective in the space of serving people in encampments. The approach that we take to engage and organize a response is one that's centered on leadership. And from the service manager or CBO level, we're really looking to know that someone is empowered to take charge in this space. In the absence of there being a clearly defined leader that looks at things from the perspective of the municipality in particular, and I suppose in some jurisdictions, province or territory, you have many different departments who are all trying to lead in the same time. So you have, for example, a social service response, usually the system manager trying to marshal street outreach resources to go. And meanwhile, you have bylaw doing their thing, and you might have law enforcement doing their thing, and public right-of-way and transportation doing another thing, and all of which are frontline staff of those different groups who are engaged with people in the reality of living in an encampment, but without anybody or any strategy or any approach that's holding it all together. So really taking lessons learned that when there's appointed leadership for the government interests, and that can be a government employee, but it could also be someone who's empowered from the community sector to play that role, we can hold together those different elements across different departments and have one consolidated understanding and approach and strategy rather than these different competing strategies at the same time. We also want there to be a range of key representatives of people who are participating in some sort of table or convening relative to a community's response to encampments. In that, we would want to make sure that there's people with lived experience and peer-led organizations. We would want there to be equity experts, street outreach providers, advocacy organizations, cultural leaders, lawyers, police, fire, bylaw, and a whole range of others. But getting all these different groups kind of working in the same direction and getting their input in the process of what is happening to support people in encampments. And when it comes to existing encampment leadership, it's also been clear in this process that different encampments in different parts of the country have completely different leadership and governance approaches. That diversity can certainly present some challenges in a local level where you have more than one encampment and they have different approaches to leadership. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage with encampment leadership. Whether that encampment leadership is people who are living within the encampment, or whether or not that leadership are other allies that are entering in and supporting leadership and voice of people with lived experience in that space. A centralized information repository, one might think of it as kind of the brain that holds together all information related to encampments. So it's not that each department or entity has a different piece of knowledge and nobody is talking to each other, that we have one spot where we know things like how many encampments are there currently in the community, and how many people are living in those encampments, and how many structures are there, and how many animals are there, and those sorts of pieces of information really important to make sure that they're consolidated and understood. Again, not for the purpose of surveillance, but for the purpose of guiding resources in implementing service delivery. And finally, in this section, I'll suggest that one of the challenges that communities face is getting people to agree on what problem is to be solved. And on this part, I want to be really clear. People are not the problem, right? Encampments are not necessarily the problem. They are often the symptom of other problems, but they're not the person's problems. That said, a response to encampment probably cannot cure everything that's wrong with income supports and benefits. That might be out of scope of a problem to be solved. Or saying that we're got a broken mental health system, and that may not be fixed as part of an encampment resolution approach of service. So we really need to be clear in terms of what's in and out of scope. Then communities benefit from a sustained response. So having a service response table, table being more figurative than literal, potentially, especially in the COVID era. Who do we convene? When do we convene them? What do we convene them about? What's within the purview of the leader operationally? What needs to be shared? How do we get decisions made? What's the governance? Really important conversation. In terms of mobilizing resources, well, in most places, street outreach is going to be the go-to. But if you're a smaller community or a rural community, you may not have street outreach and you still have encampments. So we have to think about mobilizing those sorts of resources as street outreach functions as opposed to street outreach workers in some instances. And that requires a fair amount of leadership to navigate how you have staff who may be asked to do things that are outside their job description, unless it came with the other duties as assigned part of that job description. And mobilizing these resources based upon needs. So really making sure that we're making calculated decisions, for example, of where we send certain resources at certain periods of time, and then knowing encampment structures and pets or service animals. So the process that we'd use in that is to make sure that there's rapport and trust that's built with people, understanding personal and encampment-wide needs, and taking care of survival and safety needs first. And then with consent, collecting and securely storing information on people that are living in the encampment for the purposes of designing a service response, completing an encampment-wide assessment as well as a personal assessment for each person in the encampment. The consideration, especially in communities that have multiple encampments and or very large encampments, mapping out where encampments are located Again, not for the purpose of surveillance, not for the purpose of giving the information to law enforcement, but to keep track of what is happening and where resources need to be allocated, but also keeping track of outputs and outcomes related to encampments. And with consent, cross-referencing the people who are living in encampments with things like the by name list, HIFIS or HMIS to understand services used currently or in the past, and may want to also cross-reference it with street outreach caseloads as appropriate. We want to monitor how the encampment changes over time. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it staying the same? We want to flag instances where there are potential safety concerns, with the first approach being one of trying to address the safety concerns without requiring any sort of closure of the encampment, knowing the general condition of the structures, identifying those opportunities where we should bring more supplies for people's service animals or pets, and making sure that those needs are taken care of. And we also probably want to create some data dashboards to keep track of what is actually happening relative to the activities occurring with people living in encampments. And then there will be, as I said, those extreme cases where closure is going to be necessary. And what we want to do is have a transparent process for how those types of decisions are made. So it's not just the leader sitting back and deciding that they're going to close an encampment, that there's a process that's followed, usually in consultation with others, and many of those same key representatives that I was mentioning just a couple of slides ago would be the sort of people that we want to engage with in this process. So what's the reason for the closure? Let's review all of our activities and make sure they were consistent with the right to housing. Identify the legal justification transparently. Ensure that there's effective communication. Prepare and post notice, and you have to think through what goes on your notice, but usually there's some sort of commentary on the legal justification, what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, who to contact, and why. Increasing both street outreach and rehousing efforts, which can be redeploying some staff to engage in encampments for that purpose. Making sure that logistics are organized. So this would be things like which government entities like transportation or public or sanitation or public works or whomever is going to be engaged in this process. What's the role of the police? And we would like to suggest, or I would like to suggest, the police don't lead enforcement responses, that they are there to make sure people are safe as opposed to leading enforcement. If there was like third-party toilets on the site or hand washing stations on the site, we have to make sure that property is taken care of. We should also identify a space to debrief with people impacted by the closure, providing bags and totes for people to collect their stuff. And I would also suggest consider storage opportunities for people's stuff, especially in the most immediate time frame of an encampment closure. Arranging assistance for animals, arranging transportation assistance if people need to get elsewhere in the community, to have even temporary, safe and appropriate place to stay. And then I think really importantly, before anything else happens, reviewing the site for and then storing items of obvious value that are in plain sight. Prescriptions, money, identification, photographs, etc. But I'll also stress in plain sight. Not suggesting that we go through every single belonging or thing that is on the site, and really being examining how do we store stuff safely, and how do we communicate to people how to get access to the stuff that might have gone into storage. And then there's a closure of the encampment, but the encampment most often would be closed only for the period of time that there's actually dismantling. And even when it comes to dismantling, always best to have people who are impacted take care of those sorts of activities themselves, rather than showing up with bulldozers and just plowing everything over. Those are the highlights. I know in just a couple of minutes, Tim is going to come back on and walk us through any questions that came up in the Q&A box, but would really strongly encourage you to review the draft for discussion. And please take the time to email your written feedback to info@caeh.ca on or before February 26, 2021. While we have done a fair amount of engagement over the past few months to get to this point, I fully acknowledge and embrace that there's more interaction that needs to occur. It will make the document that much stronger, that much more supportive of a housing-focused and rights-based approach to meeting the needs of people living in encampments. And Tim, with that, I'll turn it over to you to see what Q&A or other items that may have come up in the chat function that we want to address.
Right on. Well, I'll give everybody a minute if they have any questions to put them into the Q&A. I don't see any right at the second. Thank you, Iain. I think one of the early comments or questions that came up was how your document relates to the document that Leilani Fairhop put out in her when she was special rapporteur that offered some guidelines, a protocol rather. I think that from my perspective, and Iain can jump in, I see these two documents as being complementary. Leilani's put out a very helpful and very useful document that I'd encourage you all to have a look at. Kathy has Crow's put it up in the chat. I would encourage you to download it. And we've endeavored to the best of our ability to ensure that the recommendations or the guideline or the suggestions we have in this toolkit are consistent with those protocols. Joshua has a question here. Actually, Iain, sorry, I'll just stop. Let's see if you wanted to jump in on that last.
No, I would just echo what you said. So
okay. So Josh was asking, what are the reasons you consider legitimate for an encampment closure? An example was given earlier of a flooded area, but when that happens, if people have somewhere else to go, they leave voluntarily. Here, government has issued public safety orders as the justification for clearing encampments, citing crime, health risk to residents as the rationale, as if displacing people from one site addresses either of those problems. In some instances, government has used a lack of access to adequate waste disposal or other health infrastructure that government controls as rationale for closing encampments.
yeah, I think you're really getting into one of the meaty parts of discussion that really needs to be fleshed out some more. And here's why. I think that there are definitely instances, probably loads of examples we could all share of moments throughout the country where, in particular, this idea of crime, safety, or health, just in broad strokes. So not without specifics and not without any approaches to try to remediate that, and not without any attempts to house or provide supports to people. It just seems to be broad stroke. It's a health issue. Let's close it down. No posting of notice, no engagement, no follow through with people. And what happens in those instances, and I think you're alluding to this in the question, is people will just move from one place to another. It hasn't solved anything. Those same reasons for justification will just pop up somewhere else. And this is why a housing focused approach is so important, I think, so that we can better support people in the moment with the orientation towards trying to solve the person's homelessness while working with them, as opposed to sweeping it under the rug or just moving people along as they go forward. Now, that said, there could be some very legitimate safety concerns. Fires come up a lot, especially open fires. Now, there's ways to do fires more safely, and there's ways to get permits for fires. There's also going to be instances where the proximity of fire to structures presents huge risks. And that might be structures within the building. That might be other structures that are near the encampment. So I think that becomes very local in terms of considerations. When it comes to things like trash or health concerns because of trash, I mean, there's other ways to resolve trash issues that doesn't immediately require pushing people out of an encampment.
Yeah, and my view is similar. Like I think, Josh, any of the items, in my view, the closure of an encampment and that it would be the very last. I think you want to close an encampment because you've housed everybody in it. I mean, I think that's the preference. I think in a closure of an encampment and other circumstances should be the very, very last resort after everything else has been attempted in housing, in terms of achieving housing and shelter, that the people in the encampment are preferring. And to my mind, none of the things that you mentioned would meet the threshold to me of what would be acceptable. Like I don't see, fire safety, other things. There are ways of ensuring people's safety and making things safer. I think the ultimate objective is that nobody's in an encampment because they've all got homes to go to. April has a question here. I'm curious about using the shelter system. Isn't this just moving people in encampments to another form of shelter, but not really addressing homelessness?
I would just echo that I see shelters as an interim measure when they're safe and appropriate. And I'll just restate before, I don't think that shelters end homelessness, but I think that they can be a safe and appropriate interim measure. But shelters are not going to put an end to all encampments if that was the concern of the community, or their strategy was just, we need one more big shelter and everything will be fine. I think that's an oversimplification. The potentially, based upon the needs of specific people in that needs assessment, shelter options may be considered under certain circumstances. And in particular, if it provides, for example, greater safety from the elements, and someone wants to go, that is certainly worthy of consideration. But if it was implied, certainly it didn't mean to, the shelters are the answer. Shelters are an interim strategy. They are not the strategy.
Robin is asking, do you know if there is anything on the horizon with HIFIS, like a link to GIS mapping or other modifications to better serve outreach purposes? And do you have any references, she says, other than your excellent book, on the issue of sanctioned encampments?
I'm not a HIFIS expert, so I don't want to lean into that one. If there's another person who is with us who has more information on that, that would be great. In terms of sanctioned encampments, there are some peer-reviewed research. It's predominantly West Coast, and it's the majority of it is American, that looks at the experience of some of the sanctioned encampments in places like Seattle and Portland, and their experiences with it. So that might be helpful. There's also been, it's like a staff report, some work that had been done in Hawaii relative to the costing of their experiences of sanctioned encampments. And I know that there's been at least one and probably more newspaper articles in national newspapers that have tried to dig in a little bit more into the issue of sanctioned encampments. What are the pros and cons? Those sorts of things. But I wouldn't say that there's just like one core document, and perhaps someone knows of one that discusses all matters related to sanctioned encampments from all different angles.
There's one other Canadian reference. There's a gentleman named Eric Wiseman, who's a professor in New Brunswick, I believe. He's got some research, his PhD research was on this topic, I believe, and has some stuff available on the homeless side. Stephanie has asked in the chat, maybe this answer is obvious, she says, but we're from a rural community and have a hidden encampment in town. The feeling of secrecy and fear around this encampment being discovered is strong. How would you suggest obtaining access to help set up outreach for situations like this?
Well, I will say that while I've certainly encountered that in rural and small town environments, I've also encountered it in large urban centers, like people who want to be more out of the way and not found, and have made deliberate choices in terms of where they want to be unsheltered in that regard. And there is concerns that if people had found out about it, they'll come in and bust it out, and it'll all be gone. So I think there's a bit of that, or we're kind of the a bit of the if nobody sees us, no one's going to bug us approach. So we won't have any neighborhood concerns. We won't have any complaints. Some of those locations, I'll also say, can be really great until the leaves fall and then people can see them. So sometimes secret becomes not so secret as the seasons change. I certainly had that experience. But I think when it comes to how would you suggest obtaining access to help set up outreach for situations like this, it really is that rapport building and trust, which may start off site. So if there's a particular individual that's using other resources or services in the community, and there's an opportunity to gain trust there, that might be more advantageous than just descending upon the encampment if it ever was discovered, and seeing if you can secure an invitation to engage would be my approach. But it also, I think, kind of to the question, speaks to the importance of security of data in this place, right? And the security of data, not sharing data for the purposes of enforcement, but sharing data for the purposes of service. So if encampment is known and it can be shared safely with people who can provide supports, and there's consent to do so, that's a really good idea. When that consent isn't in place, or there isn't that trusting relationship between various actors who might be involved in supporting people in encampments, then it falls apart, and then people who live in encampments can become very suspicious, not just of law enforcement, but of anybody who wants to engage with them in the encampment.
There's a question from Denise who's saying in Hamilton, the city agreed to use risk assessment to determine where best to place people who are in encampments. Some people were placed in motel rooms, others in shelters, but shortly after, some, maybe most, were back on the streets. How do you stop this endless cycle?
Well, I think, so this is where I'll go with this. It's got to be housing focused as opposed to shelter focused in terms of long-term solutions. Now, if we are thinking about, the likes of motel rooms, they're not an absolute answer under any stretch of the imagination. That said, there will be some individuals who may choose that sort of environment because it provides a bit more privacy, autonomy, those sorts of things. But for people where it is, there's a shelter space, but there's no follow through or engagement over the long term to track how the person's doing. I mean, you could have an individual that engages in a housing based activity while they're living outside, and that work doesn't have to stop because they move into shelter and transfer them to another person. So we might want to think about that, in terms of how do we have workers attached to people as opposed to people attached to facilities, and thinking through it that way. In terms of, this idea of the cycle, I think that this will again come down to the individuals that we're supporting towards a housing solution have choice and have rights. And freedom of mobility is one of those rights that doesn't go away. So we can make a match as the system allows to do it, but it's still going to be the individual's choice of whether or not they think that match works best for them. I think that you might be better served, or some communities might be better served, by really thinking through how we attach workers to people rather than attaching workers to facilities, if we want to get some of the housing outcomes that are intended through this process. So if people do return to back outside, we're not starting from scratch. The worker just continues to follow them in place.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, when I hear situations like that, to me, it raises questions about the housing and supports that were offered versus the people they were offered to. And, I would be going back, and this is why, the rights approach is so important, and engaging people and knowing, as Iain says, that they have rights and they're free to move wherever they want. So the first thing I would be doing is asking the people who left, why did you leave? Like, why are you back here? And what would you like that you weren't able to get where you were, that made you want to move, right? Give them something that they want in order to solve the problem. There's a comment and a question here from an anonymous participant. They're saying, how about obligating owners of empty homes to put them on the market as rentals as a price the market will bear, rather than the inflated price they may want to ask for, and in that way increase the available affordable housing, or the available housing stock. in Victoria has roughly 17,000 housing units. If 10% are empty, that's 1,750 empty homes. We have about 250 people sheltering in parks. There appear to be zero will in getting these homes on the market. Also overpriced rentals that sit empty and landlords unwilling to lower the price. Can government impose a max time a place can sit empty when listed as a rental without lowering the price?
I have no idea. Not a lawyer.
I think that's the same. That would be my answer.
It's an intriguing idea, and worthy of some exploration. But I'm sorry, I don't have any immediate response to that, other than to say, all right, something else to think about.
All right. Well, I think that is everything. That's all the questions that we've got. Thank you to Iain for all the work that you've done in pulling this toolkit together. Thank you to all of you for participating. Please do take a minute to download the full report. Also, feel free to send us an email anytime before February 26th, in 2021, last year, to give us your feedback. We'll also, early in the new year, be sending out some information on roundtable discussions we'll be hosting on the toolkit. With that, thank you all very much. Thank you for all the work you're doing in support of people who are experiencing homelessness, especially those who are living in encampments during COVID. Please take care of yourselves, and all the best of the holiday season to everyone. Thank you, Iain. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again very soon.
Bye now.